No one noticed the day CEO Toan disappeared. There was no headline, no urgent meeting, no sudden pause in the rhythm of the city. His name slowly faded from conversations, replaced by new projects, new leaders, new concerns. Life, efficient and unforgiving, moved on as if he had never mattered. Only Tu Diem felt the absence as something physical, like a cold wind that never stopped blowing. She sensed it in the quiet mornings, in the empty space beside her, in the way time seemed to stretch painfully when nothing arrived to fill it. While the world forgot, she remembered every word he had spoken, every promise left unfinished. At first, she believed his silence was temporary. Powerful men vanished all the time, she told herself. They retreated to solve problems no one else could understand. She waited with patience disguised as faith. Each day she checked her phone, rearranged her hopes, and told herself tomorrow would bring answers. But tomorrow never came. When the farm owner asked her to leave, Tu Diem realized how fragile her life had become. With no contract, no savings, and no one willing to speak for her, she packed what little she owned into a worn bag. Her phone, cracked and unreliable, went dark before she reached the Moulton Road. In that moment, she was no longer just waiting for Toan, she was losing everything else as well. The countryside received her without questions. An old woman offered her a place to sleep, a bowl of warm rice, and a silence that felt kinder than pity. Tu Diem learned to chop cassava, patch leaking roofs, and wake before dawn. These small tasks grounded her, reminding her that survival required movement, not longing. Yet at night, when the mountain air grew heavy and the lantern flickered, her thoughts returned to the same question. Why had no one looked for him? A man who once commanded respect had vanished without consequence. Was power truly so temporary, or was he never as important as she had believed? As Tu Diem lay awake, listening to insects fill the darkness, one truth became painfully clear. The world had chosen to forget CEO Toan, and if she stopped searching too, he would disappear completely, taking with him the last piece of her unfinished past. Morning in the mountains arrived without kindness. The air was cold, the ground damp, and the day demanded effort before offering comfort. Tu Diem rose with the old woman before the sun appeared, learning to move quietly, efficiently, as if the world might break if she disturbed it too much. There was no time for longing here. Firewood had to be collected, water had to be carried. Hunger did not wait for memories to fade. Yet, even in the rhythm of survival, Toan followed her like a shadow. The sound of an axe striking wood reminded her of his voice, calm, decisive, once full of certainty. She wondered how a man who had stood so firmly in control could vanish so completely, leaving behind no explanation, no trace, not even a rumor worth believing. The old woman never asked about her past. She offered shelter the way mountains offer stone, solid, wordless, unquestioning. In the evenings, they ate simple meals together, listening to the wind push against the walls. Sometimes the old woman spoke of her own losses, not directly, but through small stories about people who had left and never returned. Tu Diem listened carefully, sensing that pain did not need names to be understood. A man named Thu began to visit the small house from time to time. He brought rice, tools, and news from the village below. He spoke gently, his eyes observant but respectful. Unlike others, he did not look at Tu Diem as someone broken or in need of saving. He treated her as someone passing through a difficult season, nothing more. One afternoon, as they repaired the roof together, Thu mentioned Toan's name without meaning to. It slipped into the conversation like a spark. He had heard rumors, distant and unclear, about a family leaving the country, about a man who was never seen boarding the plane. The details were fragile, but they were more than silence. That night, Tu Diem could not sleep. Hope, dangerous and bright, returned to her chest. For the first time in weeks, the future felt slightly less closed, but fear followed closely behind. What if searching led only to disappointment? What if the truth, once uncovered, erased the last reason she had to keep believing? As dawn approached, Tu Diem made a quiet decision. She would not let fear decide for her. Whether the path led to answers or heartbreak, she would walk it herself. In a world that had stopped looking for CEO Toan, she would continue, because searching was the only way she knew how to stay alive. The road down the mountain was narrow and uneven, carved more by footsteps than by intention. Tu Diem followed it at dawn, her bag light but her heart heavy with questions. The village below slowly came to life, shops lifting metal doors, motorbikes coughing awake, the smell of breakfast drifting through the air. Ordinary scenes, painfully familiar. Life here did not pause for missing people. With Tu walking beside her, Tu Diem felt both supported and exposed. He spoke little, allowing the sound of their steps to fill the space. When they reached the local police station, the building looked smaller than she expected, its faded walls bearing the weight of many untold stories. Inside, a ceiling fan turned lazily, as if even time moved slowly there. She explained everything in a steady voice that surprised her. How she had been forced to leave, how Toan vanished without warning, how his family had disappeared as well. The officer listened, nodding, writing things down that felt too fragile to be trapped on paper. He asked careful questions, none of them offering comfort. What they knew was little. The family had indeed gone abroad, their departure recorded and legal, but CEO Toan's name was missing from the passenger list. No exit record, no reported crime, no reason for an investigation to begin. In the language of bureaucracy, Toan had not disappeared. He simply no longer existed in the system. The words landed softly, but their impact was sharp. Tu Diem felt a strange emptiness, as if she had reached the edge of a map. Beyond it, there were no directions. The officer suggested waiting. He suggested patience. He suggested acceptance. None of those felt possible. Outside, the afternoon sun was unforgiving. People passed by laughing, arguing, bargaining over vegetables. A woman scolded her child. A man answered his phone impatiently. Tu Diem watched them, realizing how thin the line was between an ordinary life and being completely alone. As they walked away, Tu offered no false hope. He simply said, "At least now you know where the silence comes from." His words stayed with her. Knowing did not erase the pain, but it gave it shape, and shaped pain, she realized, could be carried. That evening, back in the mountains, Tu Diem sat quietly by the fire. The search had not brought Toan back, but it had changed something inside her. She was no longer only waiting. She had faced the absence, named it, and survived it. In a world that had erased CEO Toan, Tu Diem remained, still searching, still breathing, still refusing to disappear. Evenings in the mountains arrived quietly, without warning, like truths people avoid until they have no choice but to face them. Tu Diem sat on the wooden steps of the small house, watching smoke rise from nearby kitchens and disappear into the darkening sky. The search had ended, at least on paper. No more places to ask, no more doors that might open, and yet something inside her refused to settle. She returned to daily work with steady hands. She helped the old woman grind cassava, repair broken fences, and carry water from the stream. These tasks were simple, repetitive, almost meditative. In their rhythm, she discovered a fragile peace. Each movement reminded her that life continued not because answers existed, but because breathing demanded it. At night, she no longer waited for her phone to light up. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It no longer screamed, it whispered. Sometimes it asked questions she could not answer. Sometimes it simply sat beside her, like an old companion who had nothing left to prove. Tu Diem thought often of Toan, not as a powerful CEO, but as a man who had once spoken softly in moments no one else saw. She wondered if he too was living somewhere quietly, trying to survive his own disappearance. The thought no longer filled her with anger. It filled her with a distant, aching understanding. One morning, Thu mentioned a job opportunity in the village. It was modest, uncertain, but real. Tu Diem hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Choosing to work felt like choosing herself, and that decision mattered more than she had expected. As she walked down the mountain again, this time alone, she realized something important. Searching for Toan had been her way of holding on to the past, but living, truly living, required stepping forward, even without closure. The world still was not looking for CEO Toan. Perhaps it never would. But Tu Diem had learned that being the only one who cared did not make her foolish, it made her human. And as the sun rose over the valley, illuminating ordinary homes and ordinary lives, Tu Diem understood the quiet ending of her story. She had not been left behind, she had simply reached the moment where waiting ended and becoming herself began.